We're live on YouTube. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth session of Sheltering Places, Thinking the COVID Pandemic, hosted by myself, Mohammad Salemy of the New Center for Research and Practice, as well as Reza Negarestani and Valentin Golev. We have a very exciting program tonight, but before we get to that, I just thought of bringing up a few things that have been preoccupying my mind about what has been going on. Scientifically, I just read something in Hong Kong news that in the lab, coronavirus acts like the HIV virus, which means that it eats and it attacks and destroys T4 cells. So this is like a new development, and they're trying to find out what does it mean. If that's what happened in the lab, is that how it works in the human body or not? Also, economically, we heard today in Germany that during this lockdown, the economy will shrink 20%, but overall during the year, if it comes back, the shrinkage will be around 4%. Also, there are other things that I would like to bring up, but I think because of the heaviness of the program and how we have so many important people waiting, I think I would just like to ask Jason to take over, Jason Mohaghegh. But just before he takes over, I want to say that he's back by popular demand, because last week we kind of made it short, and we decided to keep the 2.5 hours, but we received so many harassing messages on YouTube that why did you cut Jason off? Jason had a lot of important things to say. Jason should talk. So we thought, okay, we're going to start with Jason to sort of as a form of apology to the audience who really expected to hear more from you. And yeah, and also just for you to sort of continue what you were saying last week. So I don't know where we were. There's been a lot going on, but if you can just connect what you're saying, I will just pass it on to you, and you can kind of continue on, Jason. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Course, yeah. People should be careful what they wish for, but I'm happy to sort of roll into some new dimensions today. 3 things that since the last time we were talking about games, we were talking about philosophies of vanguards and violence. 3 new things that have been intriguing me in the aftermath of the last conversation that I want to bring up today are: 1, dreams of inexistent things. So a new type of dream theory. 2nd is I'd like to discuss quickly individual hysteria and mass hysteria as paradigms. And 3rdly, doomsday costumes have been of interest to me lately. So just to start out, most people know that dream theory in psychoanalysis states that whatever distorted forms we behold in our dreams are usually forces of what they call wish fulfillment. So pleasurable dreams are supposedly tapping into primordial drives like eroticism, aggression, dreams of libidinal energy that usually, I mean, psychoanalysis, Freud has this insane sort of list of disguised symbols that if you see balloons, knives, fountains, reptiles, boxes, jewels, sweets, fruits, falling or sliding motions, then you're in one of those sort of drive states. Interestingly, the same logic holds in psychoanalysis for nightmares, whereby frightening figures necessarily derive also from ancient fears. And the most primordial ancient fears that come from our supposed originary psychic recesses are death, humiliation, separation, pain, things of that nature. So those dreams might include symbolic experiences like being chased or having your teeth fall out, long journeys, being immobilized, covered in insect swarms, or meeting threatening strangers. I just did that whole dance in order to negate it, though. I'm not interested in psychoanalysis's dream theories and the reductive enclosures of their symbols as much as I am about escaping the archetypal psyche. So I'm interested in how in a time of pandemic, we might be in a perfect atmosphere to start dreaming unforeseen things. And those are things like no other. So the question is, in what specific circumstances can we go beyond archaic symbols, signifiers, and become seduced by appearances that are exotic, surprising, extemporaneous, preternatural, one-of-a-kind things, things that have no right to be, things that are unparalleled and have never existed before. And actually, I think if we go back to the ancient world of idols and hieroglyphs, there's this mistaken approach to the ancient gods of the ancient civilizations, whereby we think that those are, again, abstract embodiments of archetypal human experiences, gods of thirst, gods of of war, things of that nature. But if you look at their actual physiologies and physiognomies, if you look at those ancient stone faces, which were usually disfigured or carved in weird animal shapes or purely alien a lot of the time, it had nothing to do with established codes of beauty or horror, and it even had nothing to do with what you could call the knowing subject or the unconscious. Rather, it was this visionary threshold where human beings could trespass into the unthinkable. And I'm interested in that dangerous imagination. I'm interested how in times of pandemic, it might be conducive to our striking at those outer boundaries. The second thing is individual hysteria and mass hysteria. It's a common theory of madness that it's exponentially harder to share the same insane experience. One person can sort of plunge into a psychotic state, but for two to have the identical mad experience is very rare. But so as a result of that, for all of you as a kind of small gift, I've been researching figures throughout history who actually could masterfully implant their derangements into the minds of others. And I'll give three quick examples of that if you'll permit me a little bit of storytelling. The first is actually well known to a lot of people, two figures. Maurice Blanchot made a challenge to Georges Bataille once, and Blanchot had gone into solitude and retreated to southern France, and supposedly this encounter happened while they were walking on a beach. And Blanchot just mused this one challenging question to Bataille that Bataille said later drove him mad in his writing, which is basically Blanchot said, "What if you wrote as the last man?" And the actual exact quote is, "What if you pursued your inner experience as if you were the last man?" And this sent like a contagion into Bataille's mind. Both individuals became obsessed by this question or this proposition, and both ended up writing many works in the coming years dedicated to exploring the idea of writing as the last man or the last human. And it gave rise to the most stunning meditations on torment, solitude, ecstasy, disaster. And I'm intrigued then whether or not now is precisely the time in the age of pandemic for us to resurrect these paradigms of creating as the last humans. And to ask what that means to be the last poet or the last philosopher, or to write the last book, or to have the last thoughts, whether it's true or not. And I'll just say this, actually far more intriguing and complex than Blanchot's even challenge to Bataille is ancient fire cults. There was a sect within fire worshippers that believed that fire was actually not eternal. So their God force was actually finite and would irreversibly exhaust itself eventually. And so there was this question among the fire cults as to what the last fire should look like. And this was a great philosophical and aesthetic and existential question that they had to encounter, because they felt they had to stage a kind of final affirmation or an honoring of the last fire. And there were these great debates as to whether or not it should be some maximalist thing like this massive conflagration or a bonfire, and others just like the simple fragility of a single match or a lantern being lit in the forest and then dying out in their hands. Both of these are stunning aesthetic provinces of imagination. And I think that we're in precisely that kind of wild spectrum where we could envision what it means to do the last things creatively. The other two examples I want to just give quickly are from Sufi mysticism. Every once in a while I dabble with the old medieval mystics. And one of the things that, well, let me say this at the outset, a question persists as to why mystics have been burned at the stakes and crucified for millennia. And I'll say just quickly that it's basically because they contest the two dominant narratives of the world, which are held by political and religious orders. So on one side, political, economic, social, and cultural structures teach us that there's only one world, that it's the plane of material, physical reality. It's what I can touch, see, dominate, exploit, conquer. And that narrative suits them because that's where their authority thrives. On the other side, you've got your religious orders and even some philosophical schools who tell us that no, there are two worlds. There's this one, but then there's actually this other one, and this one is just a mere fraud or a test or a waiting room for the real show, which is in the afterlife or the transcendent world or the ideal or the eternal or whatever you want to call it, which is where authenticity actually exists. And then these wonderful mystics come along and they throw a playful but violent curve into their logic. They say, how about this? There is only one world, and it's this one, and it's a total illusion. So it's a figment, but without reference to some opposing reality or authentic existence. There's no dialectic here. Rather, this is it, but it's all smoke and mirrors without substance. It's all dream without waking. It's intoxication without a return to sobriety, or a hallucination without a return to calming forms of the real. So what I'm intrigued by this is that in times of pandemic, we actually can see the possibility for images, thoughts, and storytelling to take on contagious capacities. And I want to give two sort of mystical examples of this. There's this absolutely wonderful mystic by the name of, Persian mystic by the name of al-Ghazat al-Hamadani. And this is a matter of public record, supposedly. There's this fascinating historical account where he was known to pick up his decapitated head and run into a graveyard. So basically what happened is after he was executed by the political and religious orders of the day, his corpse was thrown into a public square in order to be beheld by onlookers and mocked and all of that. At which point, another great mystic, Baba Tahir, who was called Baba Tahir the Naked One, because he used to roam around the desert. Naked and sort of speaking to God, ranting and raving. He comes upon the body, he taps it with his foot, and he declares this almost incantatory statement. He says, "Men of God do not sleep like this," which conceals almost a resurrection spell. Now, according to hundreds of personal accounts, I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a hell of a story. Ain al-Ghazat's decapitated body then bolts upwards, grabs his head, puts it under his arm, cradles it, and runs into a graveyard where he descends into a grave and disappears. To this day, that pit is known as Ain al-Ghazat pit in the city of Hamadan in Iran. And that's a hell of a sort of contagious ability to transfer derangement across three different figures. So that's just one sort of other example. And the last one that I wanted to mention is that I'm intrigued by a genre of kind of mystical literature that happened in the medieval era called Mi'raj literature, which was sort of would recount the sky journeys of the Prophet Muhammad into heaven. And these are unbelievable surrealistic writings. At their best aesthetic levels, these books are filled with images of guardian angels and paradise gardens, hellbound valleys, meteorological things, fatal meridians. And then lastly, the gargantuan throne of God, which is the kind of climax of the story always. I mean, completely hallucinatory stuff. And it's all these lavish details in it, as well as all kinds of, for those who love phenomenology, you couldn't get anything better. I mean, it's full of descriptions of wings and silk robes, chalices, stones that plummet to the bottom of the earth, all of these things. And then again, God's colossal throne, which, just to spoil the surprise for you, when you reach it, it is a vacant throne that is spinning frenzied, sort of surrounded by headless angels who are all chanting, "The throne knows not where you are," which is a kind of awesome fever dream. And my favorite story of this is that in the midst of, like, these aren't heretical and radical enough, along comes a rogue Sufi mystic figure named Bayazid al-Bastami, who turns around and actually inverts it so that it's not the story of the Prophet Muhammad's ascent to heaven and this miraculous thing. He says he himself has the night journey, which is, I mean, enough to get you killed 7 different ways in the lands where he comes from. And what he does is actually, when he finally reaches this gargantuan throne of God in heaven, he actually freakishly flips the scales and claims that the angels now praise him, that the direction of prayer now is towards him, that the whole cosmic order revolves around his presence. He basically usurps God's throne and overthrows him. And then he has these 3 great declarations. The first is, he says, "They are all my creatures except you." He declares that to God. Then he tauntingly says, "Moses desired to see God. I do not desire to see God. He desires to see me," which is a great line. Takes a lot of conviction to say that. And then the last one, he says in ecstasy, "God is great and I am greater." So through this episode, I just wanted to contemplate an extreme limit of apotheosis, when someone actually challenges the ultimate and becomes the ultimate. And actually, if you read Nietzsche closely, at the end of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he has a similar moment where, in a piece called The Drunken Song, where he talks about the drunken happiness of dying at midnight, and all of that, he turns and says, "Oh world, do you want me now?" And this is an amazing sort of notion of the ultimate, that the ultimate is not actually to be the ultimate desiring subject, but it's to be the universally desired object. It's the world that wants you. And I think in the time of pandemic, we might actually be in a similar circumstance. We are wanted by something else, you know? And so just something to throw in there. And the last thing I just wanted to mention are doomsday costumes, because doomsday costumes are among those rare instances where we see manic and apocalyptic sensitivities occupy a shared visual space. And actually, this is something that someone asked me last week. about mimesis, that there's this mimetic gameplay of fashion that's directed toward the end of all things in the doomsday costume. So the example that probably a lot of you have seen in images being circulated is that during second waves of the Black Death, there's this bird mask that was invented. You know, a French 17th century medical doctor named Charles Delorme designed this bird-like mask with a protruding beak that remains to this day sort of in the collective imagination as something synonymous with terror. And the garment was initially modeled after the armored look of soldiers. It's this long waxen overcoat with round glass spectacles affixed to the bird mask. And it was supposed to shield doctors against contraction when examining people dying of bubonic plague. And the curved beak was actually filled strategically with scented herbs, spices, and dried flowers. And the reason for that is because they followed this principle called miasma theory back then, which was the idea that noxious smells like rotting garbage or infected flesh is what carried the substance of the plague. So this awful pointed mask protected physicians from inhaling foul airs to those they administered treatment. You know, I always actually think it's kind of a morbid fascination, but, you know, can you imagine the children of the bubonic plague whose last image was to see this bird-faced sort of doctor approach them with these leather boots, gloves, overcoat, with a wooden stick that they used to use to fend off the hands of the sick. And I'm intrigued though by the nature of these doomsday costumes because they attempt to resemble the shape of the enemy. And so think of the fact that the bubonic miasma theory believes that it's an airborne disease, which then leads to this elaborate mimetic outfit of becoming a bird because it's a disease that swoops from the skies. And so there's that. And the last thing I would just say quickly is I'm also intrigued is a form of doomsday costume with the return of blindfolds. And it happens in times of pandemic because we are fighting blind. And so I've been researching recently martial artists who practice fighting in blindness. And so all kinds of grappling techniques and touch techniques that are related to fighting with the eyes covered or shut. Then if we think of executed rebels who throughout history were given the choice of the blindfold and who often took it, not out of fear, but out of a symbolic kind of dualistic antagonism to the hood of the executioner, because it's a precise inversion. In a blindfold of the executed, only the eyes are covered, and in the hood of the executioner, only the eyes are uncovered. And so you see this sort of pure antagonism of political universes. And then a lot of people don't know about this. I just want to give a shout out to a great avant-garde movement of the 20th century, little known. 4 young French rural youth formed a movement called Le Grand Jeu, the Great Game, led by a genius named Roger Gilbert Lecomte. They were interested in near-death experiences. They were very experimental. Andre Breton tried to buy them into surrealism, and they told them to go to hell, very interestingly, and they remained autonomous. And then Breton systematically destroyed their movement over the next few years out of spite. But while they existed, these four youth, they did things like, well, they did a lot of things you wouldn't want to try. They inhaled pesticides, and they did lots of anesthesia and things of that nature to try and write while falling asleep. But one of the things that they practiced was visually was blindfold bicycling through their town. And it's a very intriguing thing, because also, if you know what was happening at the time, world wars were happening, which is kind of a state of pandemic and emergency akin to what we're experiencing. The last thing I would just say is, remember those mad kings and monks who blinded themselves throughout history, those Oedipal figures who took their own eyes out, and that they were usually bestowed. There's one thing across all civilizational narratives about people who blind themselves, that they are given the power to bless or curse cities in the aftermath. So they sacrifice their eyes, and then they can bless or curse cities, which is an interesting thing for us to consider again while we're maneuvering blindly in an age of pandemic. Cool. That's it from my side. Thank you.
It will be amazing to see you and Reza in a conversation, because I've been waiting to make this thing happen. Putting these two great Persian thinkers in the same room. It's been taken a bit of effort to have both of you available. But before we pass the mic to Reza, I just want to say that I was talking to a friend of mine who's this psychosomatic psychologist in Berlin, and he said that he's been having so many clients because of nightmares and basically kind of like people freaking out about this. So he was telling me how he's making a lot more money because and it is all Zoom based. So he just sits at home and he meets people who are really worried or really stressed or like really having like a breakdown because of what's going on. But also because he's also involved in the hospital world, he was telling me how they have already found people who are not tested, but go out to public spaces and cough because they want to pass on this imaginary disease in them. They already like restrained 2 people in Munich who, one in a public market was coughing on all fruits. And maybe it was a performance of like frightening others, or it was really thinking that they have the illness and they want to pass it on. And he was saying like it's sort of like something that health officials and police are thinking about in Germany, of people whose mental state gets to a place where make them want to pass this on, whether they test it or not, or have it or not, regardless of that. So that's what came to my mind. But I'll pass on the camera and mic to Reza to kind of like talk to you. Reza, go ahead.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you very much. Fantastic talk. I would like actually, so I talk a little bit, a few points to get your ideas about, and then I pass the mic to David, because I'm sure that he's also very, informed on some of these topics. One of the things that I have been, I mean, my sister was supposed to show up, but today, but apparently she is not having internet. She's a scientist, and she's working, she has a degree in immunology and a degree in psychiatry. And she's, so basically she's living in Turkey, but she's now, I mean, I would say that at the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak in Iran, she had to make a trip to visit my parents, and since then she has stuck there. And as a psychiatrist, she has got numerous phone calls from old patients talking about that they are hallucinating, they are having extreme nightmares at night. Nightmares that are not really that they have contracted it, but like utterly surreal, hair-raising nightmares, which I have actually had so many of them too. And so hopefully she will come next week, but based on what we were talking about, that it seems that, you see, when humanity is at the brink of a true crisis of this scale, falling into what you might call to be hysteria and madness, or negative madness, is quite basically on the forefront. So we were talking about this, that perhaps tapping into the unconscious of the pandemic is at this point necessary in a creative manner. And I would say that what you started your talk with, images of a scorpion, snakes, which are not essentially horror tropes, but they are certain kinds of enigmatic cultural tropes that are shared among so many cultures. One great example of this, it's the oldest civilizational site on the planet, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which is an extremely hallucinatory site once it was discovered in, I think, post 2000, or actually late 90s, I think. The site is essentially, it's like there are concentric circles extending to the bottom. 3 main layers of these concentric circles. At the last circle, there are pillars which are made just like a typical Middle Eastern monolith, which are called trilith. They are essentially made in the shape of a human, or in basically old Chinese glyphs where you can see the Dai as a human divinity. And they are facing as if they are looking inward to the center. At the center, there are, I think, 4 obelisks, exactly like Stanley Kubrick, mirroring each other as if they are in conversation. And on them, there are reliefs of reptiles, birds of prey, insects, wild animals that were not even common to that region. And one of the things that the archaeologists looked at it, they couldn't really decipher it. And there is a fantastic, actually, I will try to find the name of the essay. That one of the archaeologists simply says that this is actually where culture is coming from. You can't say whether it's a totem site, it's to ward off evil spirits, it is a gate to the beyond, or something else, because that unconscious completely captures the emblematic figures of civilization. And another story is, when pools of liquid mercury artificially made beneath the grand feathered serpent in Teotihuacan. They had carried mercury to create lakes of the underworld as part of their unconscious, basically transcoded into their civilization. So what do you think that we should do as this part of resurgence of civilization through, in fact, a creative engagement with the unconscious, which is basically now kicking into the real?
Reza, are you bringing Jason back, or are you asking that from Simon? Or
I'm asking it, we're now asking it from Jason, and then we give the mic to David.
Sure, that was fascinating. Those are great stories. I'd love it if you would send them to me and send me some images. I'd be honored to put them in my collection. That said, everything was perfect there and in alignment with what we're sort of the trajectories we're looking at. I'm just thinking that in medical science, in the scientific world, in epidemiology, they have these terms, cryptogenesis and idiopathic, which are fancy sounding words that mean we don't know where it comes from, right? And so I wonder if we could see these architectural sites that you're describing, these images, these forms of narrative, not as forms of the individual or collective unconscious, but rather as a cryptogenetic sort of form of imagination. And the reason that I would say that is that it comes out of nowhere, in essence. The reason I say is there's actually a book that was unfortunately not read enough. It has fascinating possibilities in it. A French psychoanalyst named Francois Flauhot wrote a book called Malice a few years back. And in it, he tells a story of his most terrifying experience as a young person. He's a psychoanalyst who says, I've reached the outer threshold to practicing psychoanalyst. And he said, when he was a child, his took him to as a child in southern mid-20th century, took us in Wittgenstein. And he said, I absolutely was not ready. And he's 5 years old, older, 6 years brother, smug. Every day when his mother would send him into the basement to shovel coal into the furnace of the house, He was in that damp, dank sort of surroundings. He could feel the face of the monster behind him, the breath of it, and he would run up as fast as he could, panting breath, and his family didn't know why. He said, no. Even Lacan, sort of where this arises from, they'll say that a sort of either traumatic sort of experience or an event, or that it's from the collective unconscious. And he said, this is where they're dead wrong. That face didn't come from anywhere inside of me. It came from the radical outside. I had no anticipation of it. I had no sort of pre-knowledge or even unconscious relationality to that image of the face of Frankenstein's monster. It came to me as an omen from somewhere beyond myself. And so I would say there are instances like that, whether or not we can perceive the pandemic in that framework, or whether we can allow it then to trigger forms of imagination and image making that would be cryptogenetic, that again don't belong to any unconscious reservoir. That would be my only hope, just because I'm always looking for new tricks up people's sleeves and new forms of radical originality.
Excellent
I know originality
response.
went out with the avant-garde. I'm old-fashioned.
One thing, there is actually, are you familiar, Jason, with the work of Sander Frenzy? Particularly his early, you know that he was an assistant to Freud. And Sander Frenzy, to me, is even better than Freud, because once Freud rather vulgarizes the idea of the unconscious neurosis, Frenzy actually takes it to the ultimate degree. For him, the unconscious appears as something that he calls the alien will. It always comes from the outside. And what it does, the alien will, I will copy paste that part, which is actually the best work to be read by him is the clinical diaries of Sander Frenzy. Particularly, there is a case called the case of RN.
Reza Negarestani, right? RN.
Where basically the alien will creates a kind of geological formation to the psyche of this person by coming to the core, and he's using geological metaphors all the way, a strata, the core, where it essentially starts to create a gravity of a new person from outside. And this, on the surface of this rocky landscape, which is basically the case of RN, a patient, there are volcanoes which simply every night spew ashes into the sky.
That's beautiful. What a glorious image. That's perfection. Quick question for you, Reza. Can it be willed?
The thing,
will in
when he
encounter
talks,
with the alien will.
Yes, this is when he uses the word alien will, he does not mean will at all. It is simply a force that what you might call to reveal the cracks in the classical psychoanalytic theory of will. And it is not by any means naturalized. It is not arguing for or against free choice or what Kant calls the rational will. It is something different. So that word alien will has a subtlety in its use of will.
So is there a specific method, practice, form of sorcery that unleashes or unlocks us to the alien will?
The thing I think that he's becoming rather too Freudian, that he thinks that it only comes from reality. It is essentially something that we cannot conjure it up for him, because he's at the end of the day a mechanistic philosopher in an old-fashioned sense.
Intriguing. Perfect. Thank you.
David, please.
I was going to say, David.
Hello. Should I just start? Should I just get going?
Absolutely.
So I wanted to pick up and take this in a sort of a more schizophrenic direction. I was, and because Simon is here, I wanted to drag in complexity theory a bit. Now, a few years ago, I was writing about the work of Thomas Pynchon, and I apologize for mentioning such a Mersch author, but I do think he has a great deal to offer us at this time, because one of the things I identified while looking over his work was something I analogized as decoherence. And decoherence, for those who don't follow the quiddities of quantum mechanics, is a theoretical tool used to explain what we observe in something like the collapse of the waveform function. It is an explanatory model for it, and more specifically, the loss of the quantum system's information to its surrounding environment. And what I saw Pynchon as modeling, and I think what we are going through right now, is this moment at which a superposition of incompatible ideologies, observations, models of the world are all collapsing. And I think you can see it in real time if you just, not just if you look at people's stories on Twitter or Facebook or wherever, but if you look at the actual statistical models, because the statistical models are coming into conflict with each other, and each week seems to bring another another account of why it is that this model or that model is not actually telling us what's going to happen next with the coronavirus. I think that the thing to remember is that under normal circumstances, we simply don't suffer the effects of having these these models that are incompatible with one another. Now, we can add that they aren't, that they don't match up with the world either, but I think that's sort of a given for any model. There's always an approximation, and the trouble actually comes from the fact that these models can't match up with each other. And so when push comes to shove and we actually are confronted with an event, with a moment of decoherence that forces us to have to reconcile these, we face this great loss of certainty that all of these contradictory and superimposed ideas and facts that we have no longer are able to live within us and live within our society. They're no longer able to coexist, and so we suffer this great loss of information. We could say we suffer this great loss of one could extend it to say knowledge. And I wanted to link this back to what we had been, something I had talked about, I guess 2 weeks ago when we had the last one of these, which is the collapse and erasure of our physical space. That as we are being stuck in our homes for the most part, and even as we go out, I see, for those Philip K. Dick fans out there, I see a process something like Auerbach going on out there, as it seems that New York is melting into its into some residue left over for the past. People are saying, you know, subway ridership, airplane passengers are down to levels they haven't been in for 50 years. So that was what made me think of Auerbach, which is a fantastic book that you should read.
David, I gotta say this. The prices also has been as high as they've been in 50 years, because a flight between Frankfurt and Berlin right now is 1,200 euro.
Yeah. That these odd sorts of regression things happen. That if we look at Henry Adams' Dynamo, atoms said, okay, well, the dynamo is something that once spun up, you can't stop. And certainly since the Industrial Revolution, certainly has seen that it hasn't stopped. And, you know, this could certainly turn out to be just a hiccup. But if we were going to ask, what is it that could actually persuade the dynamo to go backwards a little? Oh, Simon here is correcting my appalling usage of decoherence. No, he's not actually. I figured he would be. It's just a metaphor. But anyway, that if there was anything that could persuade the dynamo to reverse a little for a little time of being, it would be some sort of moment of decoherence like that which we are existing in right now. And what I wanted to explore, and what I don't have a good answer for, is how that intersects with the with this collapse of the concept of physical space that I, here living in New York, living not at, but certainly close to the certain epicenters of the outbreak, have this experience of living 2 blocks away from a hospital, and yet not experiencing that hospital in any more significant way than someone who might live a mile from me, even though inside that hospital, all hell is breaking loose. And I think that because this physical distance concept has collapsed, we are what I said was that that this differentiating concept of space and individuality, that each person takes up a space, each thing takes up a space, is we are now actually looking at things in a more computationalized manner, that of quantity and moiety, in that instead of thinking of things as, okay, what occupies this space, we are thinking of things as what occupies a category, or what occupies a statistical group, or statistic in general. And it's computers that mediate that for us. So we are now talking in this more, I guess one could say quantified, but that doesn't quite get at it. But we're talking in a very different language. And so we're faced with engaging with reality in, I think, a way that wasn't really possible before, because, prior to the advent of big data or what have you, you would, in a time like this, you would duck and cover, you would hide inside, and at best you would get radio broadcasts. There's a minimization of information, but here we're confronted with simultaneously the limitation and erasure of our physical space, as well as a abundance of online information that we can get at that's not compatible with each other, and it's causing this great collapse. And I think an overall sense that we actually know less than we feel we did a month ago. And the irony of that, the bizarreness of it, I think has something to do with this shift from physical differentiation, the ability to parse out, separate information, and sort of keep the contradictions from smashing into each other and producing this decoherence, into this moment where now everything is existing in the same spot, and it's overloading us. That was where I wanted to begin, but I'd be happy to elaborate.
David, did you see that cough visualization that New York Times put out yesterday? That was kind of like went kind of viral, because it was sort of like, it showed how particles of like moisture and what they call aerosol kind of like form this kind of like vertical body, and how you really, it really kind of like, I posted it and it just like, it went crazy on my Instagram. But then I realized that it was just like really going around, because it was giving people kind of like an image of a cough, right? As like these tiny particles that like leave the mouth of the person. Also, the fact that CDC now says that the virus travels 13 feet, and that it can come to your home with shoes, like the new sort of like the new data. So I don't know, maybe Simon can ask this. So what are the sort of like pop epistemological impact of this? And I'm talking pop, I'm not talking about scientific, I'm talking about like pop epistemology, right? What is the pop epistemological impact of all of the stuff that we've experienced in the last 3 weeks? That would be my question from you, but like I leave it to Reza and kind of like philosophers and people like Jason and those guys to kind of like discuss this?
No, I think, my apologies. I think that Simon should start and answering a question and then continue with his, ideas, and then I will take it from there, or we will take it from there. Doesn't matter really. Simon,
Excellent.
please.
Yeah, no, wonderful, thanks. So the question that you guys ask about pulp epistemology is obviously sort of what we do here, right? I would say all epistemology is pop, right? Scientists are also people generally. But of course, the most interesting stuff is what it's doing to us as thinkers socially. And, we hear social thinkers, we think together, we all think together. The people we don't think are thinking together, we just don't know what they're thinking. But I thought about how to talk with you guys about this, and sort of knowing that I would have a kind of high-powered crew. I wanted to think about this in terms of, and both epistemologically and also the lived experience of it. In terms of the ethics of hospitality, right? So obviously this is going to be an ethics of physical interaction, but I think it's also an ethics of what we let into our minds and what we don't let into our minds. So the text for the plague, at least in the Western tradition, right, is going to be the Decameron. The Decameron is a wonderful piece. I mean, obviously the stories are wonderful, but it also at the beginning has a wonderful account of the breakdown in the ethics of hospitality and the different ways people responded to this, mysterious plague, the bird-like figure. So I'm gonna read you part of it. One of the things about the ethics of hospitality, right, this is we've had a breakdown in this in the West because of the immigration crisis. And I would say less so in the United States. The ethics of hospitality in the States and the way that's been challenged by globalization is very different. Or the US is just, we're a different planet over here, right? But when it comes to the European experience of hospitality and immigration, I think that there are some really direct parallels to what we see in the case of the plague. So this is just a short little thing here. This is from the opening of the camera. I just got this off Gutenberg. And Boccaccio is talking about the different ways in which people responded to the plague, and in particular, the ways in which not only were people dying, but the mechanism of transmission was mysterious. Is it 6 feet? Is it 13 feet? And one of the kinds of responses that he talks about is well, I'll just read it to you. This is the people who, instead of being moderate, let's say, instead of social distancing, things break down to the point that most of the houses were open to all comers, and no distinction was observed between the stranger who presented himself and the rightful lord. So, if you look at where this appears in prior to COVID, prior to the things we're experiencing right now, it would be in the popular imagination of Muslim immigration into Europe, right? The rightful lord is no longer in control of the house. Everything is blown open. There are strangers here, and they seem to be in control, right? So there's an imagination that Boccaccio has. There's a certain kind of response to the plague, a certain imaginative response to the plague, that is a playing out of a certain kind of fantasy about the ethics of the breakdown of hospitality. In that case, it's a negative fantasy. We do still have a crisis in hospitality. We have this crisis about what it will mean or what it does mean to spend time with other people. And I just mean that it's totally trivially, literally like, do you go for a walk with a friend? What's the ethics of that? And of course, that's not just will you infect your friend or is your friend afraid of you, but also the downstream impacts of what that might have on other people. So, you and I might hang out, that's fine, but it might lead to the death of somebody's grandmother or somebody's housekeeper. If the logic of hospitality does break down, right? If the rules that we've developed socially and the rules that we even know how to debate start to break down, what's really breaking down is an entire built environment, because hospitality, it's very different from a computer program that we write. It's very different from a contract that we sign. We rely on, in order for hospitality to work, we rely upon this kind of built environment, a set of ideas and structures, habits that we've, haven't been in control of at any point in time, at any point in the centuries of our history. So what's breaking down under conditions of plague is something that took many, many generations to evolve. It's the product of cultural evolution. So one of the things this reminds me of is a book very influential for me is Christopher Alexander, the architect, who talks about the ways in which a built environment, literal built environment, meaning a building, a room that you might inhabit, has evolved over time. And Alexander's point is that we actually don't know what the things around us are doing. We have a story about what a window does, but that story's wrong. And one of the ways you can see how wrong our story is that if you sort of think, roughly speaking, okay, what's a window doing? And then you try and build a new building, you produce these monstrosities. You produce modern architecture. You produce buildings that are totally uninhabitable, right? Things that are just absolutely hellish. I used to be a physicist. Now I'm in social science. There's some, like the funding goes down, right? But actually one thing that's really nice is that they stick you in the old part of the university. So, when I was a physicist, I lived in the most modern part, most modern wing of the university, where the donor had given an enormous amount of money to build a new, wonderful new building. And of course, they're hellish places, right? The windows are the wrong kind of windows. When you go into the social sciences and the humanities, right, then they stick you in the old part because presumably nobody wants to be there anymore. And the electrical circuits, can handle your one laptop as opposed to your supercomputer. And of course, those parts function extraordinarily well. They're really lovely places to be. One of the things I do is have my students just study the behavior of people when they're put in environments that have been built not by a process of evolution, but sort of top down by some architect. And of course, the behaviors are strange, they're unpleasant. The kinds of things that we want to do at a university suddenly no longer work. So that's the danger, right? The danger is that the ways in which we interact with each other are no longer working. Not only do we not know what to do with each other, but we also don't really know how to explain what we're doing with each other. And I don't know if people have had this experience of needing to explain to somebody why whatever social plan we had before is now no longer on, right? We don't actually have the language for that. That language can often sound, if we just say it straight out, it just is completely offensive, right? It's like, I don't want to hang out with you because I think you're going to infect me. So that doesn't work. What are we going to do instead, right? What do we do when we have to rebuild a logic around spending time with each other, around interacting with each other, and all the downstream things around working for each other, around serving each other. We have that ethics. It goes beyond, of course, the ethics of hospitality. It goes into the ethics of work. But what we have to do now is something I don't have a good answer for. So David brought up the dynamo, right, James? That chapter I think is called The Dynamo and the Virgin, right? So there's this new world that he sees, the paradigm of the dynamo, and it comes into contrast with the Virgin Mary, which comes into contrast with this older story that we have sitting there. Right now, the response to the breakdown of the ethics of hospitality is to go backwards, is to go into this older account of the dynamo, of the Virgin. And you see that among your friends, I'm sure. You see that in people who are getting really into yeast, right? And sourdough, right? People who are enjoying a sort of return to something prior to the dynamo, right? That we've stuck our stick in the wheel and broken it for a while. And that's also part of the fantasy around this. But what happens instead? I don't think we can, we can't sort of put a bomb in the dynamo and shut it down, but neither can we go back to a world of artisanal creation, right? We can't actually isolate ourselves from the fact that history has moved on. I think that would be the mistake, for example, that the right wing makes when they look at European immigration, right? They say, look, let's just shut this down. You know, here's my great book on Constantinople. It's an old story. Let's go back to that older story. That's just not possible either. All of these things kind of come together for me in part because, and it was wonderful to begin with Jason's account of Persian mysticism, because one of the places that I see in literature people thinking about the ethics of hospitality under condition of plague is when there is this contact between the European Western tradition on the one hand and the Arabic or the Persian tradition on the other hand. And so the writer on this that particularly influential for me is Matthias Enward, who has a book of his Compass, for example, is entirely about the question of disease, but also the question of thinking about, in that case, as somebody from the West with an Orientalism in his soul, thinking about what the East might mean to him. Let me just wrap this around, and I would love to sort of chat about this, you know, in a dialogue. Let me wrap this around to the question that came out at the beginning, which is the pulp epistemology. One of the things that happens in a plague, and maybe this is one of the new things that happens in a plague that hasn't happened before, is not just a breakdown in not knowing what to do with others, but also in not knowing how to think scientifically anymore, not knowing how to use the tools that we got, you know, back in the whatever 17th century. All the models do clash with each other. It's absolutely true. So we're building statistical models right now of the spread of COVID, trying to analyze a time series of, let's say, deaths. And it's, you know, whatever technique that we come up with to do that, even, you know, the best kind of Bayesian, most rigorous, most self-consistent models fails over and over again. It fails for some really deep reasons to do with the way in which you even set up the priors upon which that statistical analysis works. So I think that really, for us, raises this question, and not just for a passive consumer of scientific knowledge, but for those interested in going about creating new forms of scientific knowledge, and I would say further, more forms of philosophical knowledge, is, yeah, what's the ethics of hospitality towards ideas right now? If I hear a report that, I don't know, you know, I'm gonna struggle to pull up a good conspiracy theory on the spot. Say I hear a conspiracy theory about COVID, you know, do I let that guy into my house, right? What are my duties towards really crazy ideas right now? And I think there's a parallel here, or metaphor that's particularly fertile between you get a knock on the door and there's somebody, you know, covered in boils potentially, or at least maybe he is under his clothes, and he's also hungry, he needs to be let in. There's a parallel between that and the ideas that we're facing right now, the ideas that are coming towards us from all sorts of sources, not just the journalistic sources, but of course the sources we find online and the sources that we talk about back channel. All of the standard stories about how we analyze knowledge, and it's public, it's debatable, we take one at a time, we have, you know, recipes for how to test and accept and reject things. All those are broken down, and maybe one example of that would be the case of masks, right? People have made a lot of fun of, you know, the sort of one standard paradigm for how to build knowledge is, you know, don't wear a parachute when you jump out the plane until you have a randomized controlled trial about whether or not parachutes actually prevent death upon impact. Right? So we're in this kind of very strange epistemic situation. It's one in where I think there's an enigmatic form, there's a dreamlike form to it. But of course, if we simply let our dreams run away with us, I think we are potentially in danger of saying, okay, you know, switch off the dynamo. It's great, the subway's empty, and now we can go back to the Virgin Mary. So maybe that's a place for me to pause. I don't know if that's, Reza, am I doing this right?
Yeah, it's excellent. I just wanted to say, you know, like I just want to say it's interesting to go back to like how Einol Ghazat and Baba Tahir dealt with it. It's nice to see how the people who were dealing with the plague dealt with it, but also the ethics of hospitality. You know, we can always go back to the gay community and see how this was dealt with by not just the history of like HIV, but the way gay men are dealing with coronavirus right now is very, very interesting because just because, you know, like it's like we don't have really like physical contacts right now, or at least I'm not, but like looking at the gay social media, especially like dating apps, it's kind of interesting because it seems like a lot of the skills that were developed during the early period of HIV, when combination therapy was not available, are kind of becoming useful again. And I see my queer friends, especially the ones in Berlin, much more comfortable in finding way and understanding sort of like how to negotiate between risk and hospitality, risk and sort of like sociality, than like my straight friends. Because they're just like, they've been through this, and this historical memory kind of helps them not freak out too much and understand that like there's a trade-off here. But I don't want to talk too much because I think there's a much more interesting conversation going on between you guys. So I'm just gonna
This is just wonderful. I mean, it's funny, we're working on a totally different project. Ken Chang is a fellow at the lab here. This is on a study of Streetcar named Desire, Tennessee Williams, and then Oscar Wilde, and we're looking for sort of common patterns that queer men have constructed to handle being with others, right? And you know, the most famous line in Streetcar is Blanche Dubois, who says, "I've always depended upon the kindness of strangers." I think this is maybe the question. These are all the very sweet American versions. They're not beheaded people walking, you know, pulling themselves out of graves. It's the sort of wacky comedic American version. But yeah, I mean, you know, what is kindness? What's a stranger? And what does it mean to depend upon somebody? What are the kinds of risks that you can ask somebody else to take? What are the kinds of risks that you can ask somebody at second order to take? And maybe that's the thing that the plague really brings to fore for us. Is it's not just you know, fuck you, I'm not a coward, right? It's also the second order effect of me taking a risk on my own behalf that I think you know, standard paradigms just can't handle, right? Like the standard ethic of masculinity is, all right, let's just do the fuck it, right? But that isn't responsive to the network structure of our lives. It's not responsive to the effects that, and this is always true, but perhaps the fact that there's a virus here that is directly bringing this to the fore. Courage in the face of risk is an ambiguous virtue, or maybe the right kind of courage is a different kind of courage. It's not simply the courage to be with somebody when it might cause you great risk out of love, let's say, but there's a second order thing here that we don't quite, I would say, know how to think about. And I love the idea that the queer community has a story about this, or has an archival knowledge of this that is much deeper than the ones that we have if we just make it up like, oh, as we go along.
Valentin, do you want to bring in Oxana into the conversation?
Yeah, I would love to. I should switch off the camera. But one thing that is it's clear from all of the preceding discussion is that one is new idea that is getting more and more prominent and imposes itself on our, you know, pop epistemology or understanding of the world, is that nature is back from being a resource that we exploit, that we enjoy, is back into this being a source of nightmares, is back into being a source of something that imposes itself on us, something that is an outside rather than, you know, outside being clearly only for us. And this virus forces us to cohabitate Earth with it. We cannot really contain it into, you know, big animal farms or anything like this. And so Oxana Timofeeva, a researcher from European University in St. Petersburg, researches animals and philosophy of history, and I'm really curious to hear what she would think about it. Oxana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Valentin, for introducing me, and very nice crowd. I don't really have a kind of paper, something like prepared talk, but I appreciate how the discussion is structured. I didn't know that there is a sequence of ideas, and it kind of fits really well. So I will probably share some notes and observations, not really being too much theoretical, maybe even some practical things, because this pandemic situation brought me to a countryside where I have struggled with the cold and the pre-industrial ways of life, and so like now I'm constantly burning the wood, so I'm checking from time to time. I'm just checking the situation with this wooden stove, so that the gas will not go out of the stove and of the fireplace, and things like that. But I will probably start from the very situation of philosophy right now, because now what I observe from my networks, social networks, is already kind of tiredness caused by overproduction of discourses around the catastrophic events we are living through. And this crisis of overproduction, philosophers are to be blamed for this crisis of overproduction. I would love to say just a couple of words in defense of the profession. I think that this critique is unjust because when else? This is a good time for philosophy. This is a perfect time. The most catastrophic are the times, the better are people in our profession, because it really gives you certain, yeah, the reality so-called give you so much material to think, and proliferating of philosophical ideas is actually one of the greatest benefits that that this non-human thing, COVID-19 brought in our society. Well, I wanted to say something else. I wanted to start from Artaud's theater and the Plaque, but let me just begin from some other reference that concerns the non-human status of the virus. Now people are saying agency. This is a non-human agency, and they would refer to Latour or to whatever theory, but I would say that instead of calling it an agency, we can actually refer to Hegel and say that this is probably a perfect case of substance becoming subject. Because, yeah, what is the virus? The virus is like a visible incarnation of some substance becoming subject, in a proper sense of a subject that creates a history, that makes a change, that involves, that engages all stratas of society in its broader sense, together with all humans and non-humans being.
Okay, but Oxana, I just want to like interject for 1 second and say, like, you know, like, isn't it like the return of the substance? Because I called it like the return of natural history, right? But isn't it really a return, or it's us realizing that natural history never ended or disappeared, and it kind of just got like overshadowed by other types of history. And now with climate change, and now even more so with the COVID pandemic, we realize that this substance subject is a subject of natural history.
I think the last one, I'm coming to that. I'm coming to that in a little, in a roundabout way. Well, okay, I disagree with the ascribing agency to nature. I think that nature doesn't have an agency, but rather, and here I agree with Andreas Malm, who is talking about capitalocene and fossil capital. It has not an agency, but an autonomy, which is disrupted. And this autonomy can be compared to the autonomy of the people, to the autonomy of colonized people or poor people, and so on and so forth. But there is a temptation to interpret the virus as substance becoming subject. Well, substance becoming subject is rather a joke, but there is a grain of truth in it. There is a temptation to interpret it as a kind of revenge of nature over Anthropocene or whatever violence done by human beings over natural planet Earth. Against this temptation, I would introduce Bataille's theory. I think really we shouldn't be ashamed of referring to philosophical of applying these or that philosophical theories. It's precisely the time when they are applicable. You can prove if it works or not. You can check. It's like a moment of truth when you can really check what is working in your methodological toolbox. So in my methodological toolbox, I discovered the perfect idea of general economy by Georges Bataille. It so happened that at the beginning of pandemic, I was working on an article about sun and solar economy in Georges Bataille, and the direction I wanted to give to my ideas was slightly different, but then it changed because the external these external events I could not stay indifferent. I just decided to change the topic. So I wrote a totally different article than I initially planned, and I just applied this general economy to the pandemic and realized, and finally I understood what is the general economy. Because previously, for 20 years, I thought I understand what is this, but I didn't. I didn't. Now I understood, and here again I'm happy that this this strange possibility. Bataille says there are two types of violence. He's not the only one who opposes two types of violence, the good one and the bad one. There are other thinkers, like, for example, Georges Sorel. For Georges Sorel, the bad violence is the violence of the state, of capitalist state, and the good one is a proletarian general strike. Then there is Walter Benjamin, who is saying that there is a bad mythic violence, the violence of the law, and the divine violence, violence above the law, not above, beyond the law. And there is Georges Sorel, who is saying that the bad violence is the one of colonizers, and the good one is the one of the colonized. So in all these cases, the second kind of violence, the good one, emerges as a response, but this response is always asymmetrical. the just violence, the violence that can be justified, and it doesn't speak the same language as the first violence, the mythic or the state or the police one. So in Bataille, there are two kinds of violence too, but he gives a very strange image of these two kinds of violence. He says in his essay "Pure Happiness" that there are two kinds of violence. The first one is the one of the train that will now, but we ourselves are on its rails, and it will run over us right now. And then the second kind of violence is the one of a spider or a snake. I was thinking, so what is this second kind of violence? It's kind of structurally, it fits to my idea that there are two kinds of violence, but the spider and the snake, it's something, how to say, heterogeneous, or it's non-human. That's the difference. That's the difference in Sorel, in Fanon, and Benjamin. There are two kinds of violence, but both are human violence. Whereas in Bataille, the second kind of violence is the non-human. But in his other works, he opposes this to he opposes them as the violence of the non-human. He doesn't say that. He's saying the sacred violence, or also the god of violence. But this god is animal, as Bataille says. It's not the Christian god. It's the animal god. Because it's sovereign. It doesn't serve any means. It cannot serve any means. And being human means serve means, being a part of the system of means and ends, the profane system. And the non-human is a sacred violence. So basically, what is what is the pandemic in this regards is precisely the second type of violence according to Bataille. Is a sacred violence of the non-human, which doesn't have any goal, doesn't have any reasonable explanation. It is not subordinated to any reasonable thing. And the first type of violence, according to Bataille, is the one of reason that creates limits, the violence of limitation, which corresponds to the so-called restricted economies. What are restricted economies? Capitalist economies, socialist economies, the human economy, certain forms of human activity on earth that we know. And the general economy is the economy that Bataille calls the solar economy. It is indifferent. So the goals of restricted economy are growth and accumulation. Capital is the best example of a restricted economy. Whereas the general economy is the economy of gift. And the sun's activity is the example of the gift economy. So basically, Bataille's motto is be like the sun, share. Just share. If there is this extreme poverty in India, he says, America, a rich country, should just give all the excess of wealth it has to India without reciprocation, such as the gift economy, and without an idea that this should bring me some profit afterwards. So the solar But the solar is not necessarily good. It can be also, the sun can burn you down. And it's indifferent. In this sense, climate change or pandemic or all kinds of viruses, infections are solar violence, which kind of emerges as a response, as an answer to our intervention and our restrictive activities, to our restrictive economies. So the growth of capital can compensate itself with this solar violence. That was the point. And I started to think about the responses which our state systems give to the pandemic and to its development. And I realized that all this, if we keep in mind that this is a general violence or the sacred violence or kind of divine violence of the non-human, which doesn't have any specific goals. No, it's not like destroying humanity is not the virus's goal. It doesn't have any goal. It's just indifferent. Then the failure of all states is that their responses are exclusively restrictive, and all measures are taken are more and more restrictive. Now in Moscow, you know what happens in Moscow. In order to leave the house, you should get an electronic permission and print it, and you cannot go out without this permission, and you wait in line in order to get this.
Only 2 times a week, right? Only 2 times a week. You can get this permission.
This I don't really know.
I'm in contact with Moscow because of other work. If you walk, you're okay. But if you're not walking, if you're taking your bike or your car or a bus or a subway, you have to have this permit, but you can only do it 2 times a week, not more.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Great to know that. Because I don't know. I'm so far away in the middle of nowhere. I can go anywhere I want. I just don't have things like water, for example. But it's actually great. It's a total isolation.
But you're in St. Petersburg, so it doesn't apply to you.
Yeah. So this, I explained this more or less, this idea. So they are so inadequate in this reaction, in this restrictive. So we first of all, we close the borders of the states. Then we close the cities. Then we close ourselves in our apartments. And in our apartments, we are supposed to close ourselves against others, like family members and so on. And this is funny. Then one more. This is just an outline. General economy, the non-human violence. Should we then interpret? So what would be an adequate response? And here I must remind that Bataille's theory is an apology of the second kind of violence. And another apology is in Artaud's essay, Theater and the Plague, where he says that basically this moment, the plague, is the moment of revelation. It's the theater, and he identifies theater and plague, saying that theater is not a remedy. It doesn't heal the wounds of the society, but it is precisely the disease itself. It is like the theater is an epidemic, is a pandemic. I love this idea so much. I think that it's rarely mentioned now, but it gives me a precise image of what is really theater. Theater is is where things are for real. You are at the stage. You have to play. But who are you? So Artaud describes not a modern kind of theater, but ancient kinds of theaters, traditional theaters. And he's talking about the returning of masks. This is what I also like in the like a everyday phenomenology of the pandemic, is this return of masks into everyday life, and its aesthetic component is extremely strong, because masks are the ancient magic tool. It's on the one hand, and its meaning is ambivalent. It's on the one hand, you defend yourself from the enemy, but on the other hand, you yourself identify with the other, with the animal, with the enemy, animal too, because first masks were animal masks, as Bataille reminds us, and masks give us this idea of anonymity. You remember the Pussy Riots intervention in the Orthodox Church. They were in balaclava and bandana are old leftist parts of leftist traditional costume, so to say. This ambiguous aspect of the mask culture should not be underestimated. I think I talk too much. I will stop now and give room for some discussion.
Valentin, do you have any questions for her, or should we just continue on?
So I just, like, as a comment, I would say that I'm also disappointed that, you know, with this kind of crisis that we have now, it really felt like, you know, an opportunity for powers that be to, you know, in many ways, you know, like even like Trump, Putin, anyone could go out, give a good speech, do something for economy, against economy, for people, against people. And the way, like, it's 2 months and their response was not even opportunistic. Like, I wish any of them would be like, we use this opportunity, you know, to use this base economy that we have right now to kind of like revitalize the restrictive economies that we have, if not change them. But unfortunately, they're completely unable to deal with it. Like, this is really, really disappointing. Jason?
If I can just make a quick point, this fascinating conversation. What a figure who bridges the criterion that has been outlined by David, Simon, and Oxana, who's kind of hovering in the wings, in some ways is Kafka, and particularly the idea of the Kafkaesque. And I don't mean that in a kind of general cliche of eeriness, but as someone who had a very deliberate methodology of manipulating atmospheres and moods. And it has all the criterion that the three of you mentioned. When David mentioned the idea that we understand less as we go along, that's precisely the Kafkaesque sort of vanishing horizon of comprehensibility. You know, you understand his intentions better on page 3 than on page 33. And he has this very systematic way of sort of becoming increasingly obscure and mystifying to his own reader. And then when we get to Simon's point about the ethics of hospitality, there's probably no more merciless or ruthless or terrible host than Kafka as an author. You know, he lulls you in very subtly with a kind of metallic language, takes you into a remote forest, drives you into its inner layers, and then abandons you, and essentially leaves you there. And there are actual pinpoint moments in his methodology where you can see Kafka sort of strand his reader and desert them and punish them for having any messianic expectations of the author to begin with. You know, why did you trust them sort of at the outset? What was your sort of moral investment that you thought he was supposed to lead you to some truth or some answer or some destiny? And he actually suspends his author sort of in the wilderness time and again. And to Oksana's sort of point of fatigue, That's also something in the Kafkaesque, the weariness, the exhaustion, the tiredness, but it's a methodology. And the reason I bring this up is because we keep attributing it to the phenomenon of the pandemic or the virus as a kind of, again, outside enigmatic force. But to see an actual figure, literary or philosophical, practice it performatively, which is what Oxana was getting at the end with our talk, sort of to become it at some levels, or to emulate its methodologies or its choreographies. I think that's something we could visit, but it's something that sort of bound the three protocols together for me. But in those excellent.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jason, for this wonderful comment. Of course, I had to bring Kafka because for me, he is the one who invents how to make to speak directly, and who speak directly are animals in Kafka's prose. And animals are those to be blamed on the first time. You know, in all this popular media, when the pandemic started in China, there is more snakes or pangolin. Pangolin was were to blame for the disease, and then the first measure actually taken by Moscow government was an amendment of destroying all stray cats and dogs, because they were potential bearers of the virus. Already in February or March, they wanted to introduce this amendment, and in my chain of association, in my way of thinking, I always identify with this element to be like with the animal, with the other. What if I were not if what if I were, but I am a pangolin. I imagine myself being a pangolin in this Chinese disgusting, terrible market, together with other dead corpses in one kind of basket, and being sold to someone. And the same with this becoming viral as a politics, as the maybe even the only honest radical politics that is possible in face of the restrictedness and the shameful stupidity of the states. National states.
Thank you so much. Okay, we got Reza had to leave because actually he had to be on another Zoom operation somewhere that has to do with like some other serious stuff. So he apologized and left because he didn't want to like interrupt the flow. So I would like to maybe bring in Barrett. First of all, Aiken, you had some interesting stuff to say on the side. Maybe you want to intervene a little bit. And before we get deep into politics, right, with Barrett and you and me, because we're going to have an incredible like thing at the end, I think it would be good if you just like have some philosophical introspections. And then we're going to talk to some reports from New York. And Yaminay, what city are you in today? Where are you?
I'm in Guilford in Connecticut.
Oh yeah, so we're gonna hear some stuff from Yaminay, and we will then get to that political discussion, which I think is gonna get really interesting. So yeah, go ahead, Aiken.
Okay, I'm asking this / making this intervention right after Reza has left, and I wish he had stayed because he would agree with me.
I just wanted to say something. Like Aiken, before Aiken before Biden endorsement, hair is all nice and up there. Aiken after, hair is all over the place. Just sorry, I have to say that. Go ahead.
Well, it's also partially COVID, not being able to get a haircut. But so, okay, I see two kinds of philosophy in general, and it's not delineated just by analytic / continental traditions, but that has been somewhat what has given shape to these two strands. One strand is that of Badiou, Agamben, Zizek, Achille Membe, people who've been writing a lot about COVID, but writing about it in a way that it is in continuation with their same old ontologies, their same old theses. It's just retrofitting COVID as a way to point to their lifelong oeuvre and say, look, I was right. This is the pinnacle of what I've been saying. This proves that what I've been saying has been right. Agamben's probably been the worst case. He just posted another essay today comparing those who are going along with what the Italian government's edicts with Eichmann's, so making a World War II Hitler reference in bad taste. But arguably, after reading Zizek's book, he's doing the same thing with, you know, the psychoanalytic objet petit-a that he's been making for quite some time. But on the other hand, you have some philosophers, and largely they've been analytic philosophers, who have been making questions about jurisprudence, about you know, people being imprisoned and put in solitary confinement, meta-ethics, what sort of economics, like a debt jubilee and a socialist economic plan of a planned economy, you know, these more specific questions at times, and questions that don't reify their entire ontological premises that they've made a career from. I see the former as opportunistic and the latter as productive. So I think to say, like, you know, this is a good time for philosophy, or this is a ripe moment for philosophy, is like saying it's a ripe moment for economics. You know, there's two types of economics right now. There is the buffering and the feeding of a certain type of capitalist economics that gives money directly to insurance companies rather than to people who need this money because they've lost their insurance and so on. And then there's, of course, a more progressive socialist communist strata too. So I think that, you know, we have to parse this moment and what it means for philosophy pretty carefully, because it's you know, there's a veil behind which philosophy exists right now.
Thank you. Yaminay, do you want to like speak a little bit? Been waiting to hear your insight. You know, like I followed your environmental Pakistan project, and then I think there's a connection. I don't know if you want to sort of like talk about it. It was just kind of like a sort of like a predictive call, right? Like all the stuff you were posting there, you know what I mean? I feel like it's also like the same with Iran. Like we feel like the world has become like Iran, you know, like lockdown, shortages, you know what I mean? Propaganda, restrictions, right? So
Yeah.
if that helps to relate, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, trying to connect it to pop epistemologies and geography at the moment, there's some pretty crazy things happening on the other side of the globe. I'm very close to New Haven right now, and that's the worst hit in this maybe 50-mile radius from Guildford, which is very tiny. And it seems that poorer countries and poorer neighborhoods are very disproportionately more definitely hit compared to richer areas. In Connecticut, it's the same way. In Saudi Arabia, the Kaaba was shut down. In Iran, Friday congregational prayers were shut down. Meanwhile, mid-March in Pakistan, 250,000 people met to pray together. And these pilgrims then sort of distribute through and move freely through that space to other countries as well as they go on various pilgrimage, you know, ideas that they've already built, you know, trajectories that they have in plan. And so there's it's not a great time in general for Pakistan, but there's something really strange and interesting happening, which I'd like to talk about. It's different from the environmental project. I mean, that's environmentally, we're screwed in many ways because there's no proper analysis, there's no reporting, there's no testing. There's some testing, but it's too little to actually say how many people are sick. There's no stats on the ground. What's more interesting right now is the kind of fake news and viral social media memes that are spreading around who is doing what in the time of this crisis. So today I got a message on Facebook from a friend. It shows an image of a cityscape, and on the tops of these buildings, there are prayers happening. So there's a lockdown and people are not supposed to congregate across Pakistani main cities. However, people still are, and they are sort of resisting and refusing to comply with any kind of isolation. These groups of people are seen congregating on these rooftops, and people are boasting about it. Then a little while later, I search the image because it doesn't look like it's Karachi. It's too clean and there are too many air conditioners. And the river that's flowing in front is like also kind of shiny with large ships. So I go on, alt news or whatever, and they say, well, this image is actually in Saudi Arabia. Somebody else from Saudi Arabia says, no, it's not Saudi Arabia. This image is in Morocco. And somebody else is saying, no, it's India. India is using the image as a kind of instrument for right-wing politics.
Yeah, to foment more hate towards Muslims.
Yeah. So it's being instrumentalized in different ways in different places. And, it kind of goes full circle around and turns out that most people think it's actually Dubai, where this kind of praying is happening, perhaps near some of the camps where workers are still living and they're sort of not going back to their own homes. So it's not clear exactly if it is or it isn't Dubai, but from what alt news is predicting, it most likely is, which is very surprising. So I was connecting this to an old Monty Python skit. I don't know if you remember The Funniest Joke in the World. Have you seen that?
Please explain it.
It's made in 1969, and Michael Palin is writing down the funniest joke in the world. And the joke is so funny that whoever reads it dies. So he, after writing it, reads it and he dies. And then his mother walks into the room, gets surprised by what's happened because he's dead. And then she picks up the note and reads the joke, and then she dies. And, this kind of tumbles into like a lot of deaths across the neighborhood until the country instrumentalizes it, turns it into a weapon against Germany, and projects it on German troops to kill them, making sure that nobody English can understand the joke because it's in a different language. And to me, I was trying to understand what connections there might be between these two events. Like, why are people resisting these calls for isolation? Are they not scared of death? What is it about this ideology that prevents people from being scared of death? What is this relationship to death that's different? And also about the virus, like, what is this virus and why is it so kind of, it's kind of hard to put your finger on it. It's not exactly alive. It's a piece of information like this book. It's not dangerous on its own, but it's in the combination with the host that it becomes something that we define as dangerous. And it's kind of like a bland piece of sliced white bread, this virus, the code on this virus, because it can be consumed by humans, by animals, by various species, and very easily without much resistance. And then it leads to something that we call death, that we're afraid of. But like the virus, which has no sort of fear of death or no intention, it lives in a different world. It has its own logic. Similarly, the people who are gathering on these roofs and trying to understand and not simplify on the basis of this is irrational or this is, completely illiterate people who just fundamentalist and stupid. It's more than that. There is a different relationship and a different logic to death, to life. And that logic is something that it's beginning to be more clear in different pockets in the world.
I was comparing the sort of response by Iranian Shia believers who were breaking the self-isolation and going into mosque and being interviewed with like American evangelicals. The Iranian ones, you know, coming from the martyrdom culture, when they asked, are you not feared for your life? They were like, I'm made to become a martyr. This is nothing. I'll do anything. This is nothing. Don't make me scared of this. And then when they talk to evangelicals, they were saying like, oh, I'm safe. I'm covered with the Jesus blood. That's going to give me a different type of immunity. And then, wow, this is like such complementary, two parts of the same kind of like, you know, like same problem.
But different. Is the evangelical afraid of death or not?
Well, you know, these people were coming out of a church in the midst of pandemic. And then I think the pastor later died of the problem.
Yeah, I read about that.
But you know what? It's a different kind of like irrational bravery than the Iranian ones. I think the Iranian one is a little bit like more sort of like realistic, right? It's like they know they're going to die. But this one is kind of like, oh, I'm protected by Jesus' blood. I'm covered in Jesus' blood. Can't you see? Actually, the evangelical videos on CNN, and then the reporters kind of like have a selfie stick with the mic because the reporter is like standing far away from the person, right? But they're still trying to capture the sound, right? Very like telling. Whereas in Iran, the reporter is closer, but the reporter is in a mask, so the reporter has some kind of protection, right? But the believer is like out there going crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if this. I don't know if I would put evangelicals in the same category. There's a lot of complementary, you know, bits, people coming from here and there and bleeding in between the two. But there is something of a magical realm that the Sunni Tehreek on the one side and the virus kind of occupy. And thinking about the things that Jason was saying earlier and the stories that Jason and Reza were sharing, it feels like there is the difference in logic is so strong that it's not something like reason does not even feature as an actor. It doesn't even come close. It's not operating like that. And I find that really interesting. And I'm thinking about this virality and this kind of blandness of an idea becoming so infectious, but without even intending to be. It just happens because it's so under the radar in some way.
So, you know, and another way of like bringing these two sides together is like to think of like these two sets of complementary conspiracy theories right now about the virus, right? One is provided by, I don't know, like I think the big mainstream news came out when the Chinese authorities, some of the Chinese authorities kind of like suggested that this virus was built in American military labs and brought into Wuhan during the sort of like the army Olympics that was happening this time. The 15th edition of it was in Wuhan, right? And then there's the opposite conspiracy theory that says that this is actually Chinese military technology.
Yeah.
But there's so many fascinating parallels between the two. They both dismiss the idea of like bat to human and the wet market in Wuhan. They say that's just the cover. The reality, and then you can just easily collapse these two into each other and get really confused. Or like, I mean, how could these people kind of like basically like the story they say is the same, that like this was developed in a lab, blah 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 blah. But then the actors change. One is like America to be blamed, and you know, Iranian supreme leader basically took the Chinese propaganda and made it kind of like his line, because a few weeks ago he said this is bioweapon. Yeah. That's kind of like really, really interesting. And I think there's a lot to be gleaned from this. I was just reading sort of like on the people who basically blame this on the West. They were saying that this is a really crazy virus, that it involves like parts of the tuberculosis. They mixed like genetic code of tuberculosis and SARS. And then they covered, and HIV, and then they covered it up by planting it into this bat virus to kind of like mask the fact that this was built. And of course, there's no reference, there's no link to any scientific paper or something, but the stories are very fascinating. And like, you can just keep reading, you know, because it's kind of like, I mean, we're bored. We read a lot right now. So like, it's like, but yeah, I think there could be a lot of like investigation done, you know, related to today's kind of like conversation as another form of like, you know what I mean? Maybe not conscious or unconscious, but like that category that Freud hated as kind conspiracy as subconscious, something that between conscious and, because Freud hated subconscious. He thought this is just like garbage. It's either conscious or unconscious. But maybe conspiracies occupy that middle. But anyways,
Maybe.
I also wanted to talk to Keli, if Keli is around from New York. Keli, are you around? Would you like to turn your camera on and join us?
Sure.
There we go. Keli speaking from New York, right?
Yeah.
Tell us what's going on in Columbia University and what's going on in New York.
I think there's been a couple of things that people have mentioned that have sort of stood out for me. Just in terms of thinking about the breakdown of structures, I'm thinking a lot about how Columbia is dealing with the pandemic, and just how the structures of departments have completely broken down, and it's sort of obviously a very hierarchical model, but it's become so evident since the pandemic in that we'll receive information from the president and nobody within the departments have any information or are able to speak to anything that any of the decisions that are being made. And so I think that this is
the semester ended, right? The semester ended, right?
No, the semester is still going. The semester is still going. Everything is still on Zoom, online. But how this will move forward, nobody really knows. There is, specifically with studio-based programs, I'm doing an MFA, so how this will sort of affect the future of visual arts learning is really interesting, because I don't know how we sort of come back together to do studio classes in a way that whatever is being reflected worldwide is very, just thinking about education and its future is going to be very interesting. Most instructors now are being asked to write syllabuses that would be catered to online as sort of a way to move forward. But again, when you get into very specific programs that rely on the studio, I don't know how that's going to work out.
My feeling from information I receive is that most universities just want to finish this semester and maybe take one full year off.
Yeah, those are rumors at this point, because nobody has said anything officially. If anything, and this is where I say the breakdown of structure within sort of information and what information is able to be shared is quite glaring at the moment, because the departments are still trying to move forward as in the fall, you'll have your thesis exhibition, and then, obviously that is absolutely not going to happen, but they're still moving forward with that is, in the fall, we'll pick back up and everything will be okay again. So there's this sort of either blindness, naivete, other sort of maybe they just don't want to give us the right information, but we don't know any more or anything other than there's a pandemic happening and the universities don't know how to deal with it. But in terms of New York, I'm uptown in a very wealthy neighborhood. And
are you in Upper West Side?
I'm Upper West Side, yeah.
Jason is a Columbia graduate. He studied for his PhD at Columbia. And I'm going to say this, Jason, you're going to hate me. He was one of the last group of students whose PhD was supervised by Edward Said at the Middle Eastern department, where Hamid Abashi and all those people are now are sort of teaching. So yeah, so he can relate to some of the stuff you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, there's been articles that are coming out talking about the two different types of New York, and it's really so stupid that these articles are still coming out in this day and age, because everybody knows that class issues exist everywhere, and that this is not even news to be writing or reporting in publications like the New York Times. But certainly living up in the Upper West Side, yeah, I'm in this bubble where there's still farmers markets happening, and there's just this sort of feeling up here with very specific crowd of people up here who feel like untouchable in some ways, and it's like it's all based on their wealth stature, you know. But so it's quite interesting to think about, you know, evangelical, like sort of all these different extreme groups, and then you have like a bunch of like super wealthy, older, mostly white people also believe in this type of untouchability of this virus and continuing on as they would have prior to this.
Awesome, thank you so much. Okay, if there isn't a lot of questions for Yaminay, Keli, I think maybe we should bring in Barrett. Barrett has been kind of active with his own podcast and other kind of programming that he's been doing, especially like kind of in-person programming that he's been doing before the social distancing went into effect. Mm-hmm. And also like he really opened the floodgates for me to kind of look critically at what happened to the DNC and the primaries in New York. And I think this is a heated discussion right now among the democratic socialists in America, amongst like leftists, progressives, whatever you want to call it, right? And I think we have a good spectrum here to kind of like return to that question, because, you know, as we all know, Sanders only sort of, when was it? We lost the track of days. Or was it yesterday where Sanders, when was Sanders a show trial?
I think it was 3 days, three days ago.
Show trial was 3 days ago already, right? Because it totally looked like show trials. It looked like Stalin trials. It looked like they had arrested Sanders and had put him in front of the camera.
Oh yeah.
It was a gun or a sword behind his back saying like, you gotta say this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Because the look on his face was really frightened and like, wasn't like the normal Sanders we know from the campaign, right? So yeah, so you really opened the floodgates by thinking hypercritically about it and so like calling him out, basically. So maybe we can start with like, but that was like a few weeks ago. So maybe you kind of like have different ideas, but maybe you can just like help us.
Well, one of the things that I've sort of been thinking about now, you guys started off on a really interesting conversation. It's like, oh, I want to talk about Blanchot and the game theory and all these other things, because they're sort of tying back into my personal ideas about what it means to sort of let go of a freedom of fear in order to partake in some form of reification. And I think one of the issues that Sanders has, to try to tie that back to this whole conversation, is that like if Sanders' political ideas, and if are based on sort of like reification and hypothetical worlds, modeling new systems, or perhaps going back to a certain historical system, then what I see is a lack of willingness to devote yourself or give yourself or risk in the face of death to affirm these beliefs. And I think that this is the biggest problem that we're having, is there's not a lot of talk about, there's not a lot of people who are actually putting their money where their mouth is. So you take $150 million in donations, and who gets that money back? You know, so nobody does, you know, and to sort of drop out of the race.
That figure is very important in a conversation. I don't think many people would know what you're talking about.
What are you referring to?
The figure of 150 million. I mean,
well, it's small donations from mostly, you know, working class people who, you know, there's obviously a spectrum. And I think it's really interesting, because one of the things that I've had theoretically is that Bernie Sanders has always been sort of on a social, in the terms of a social ladder, because status and social status is not merely economic, it's also cultural. So I almost would posit that Bernie Sanders has always had this air of eliteness. And, you know, it's really interesting because Curtis Yarvin, who I completely disagree with, I don't think there's anybody whose politics are like more antithetical to mine. He actually, describes Bernie Sanders and his movement to Augustus Octavius and the Optimates, and actually Trump and his movement to Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. And if people know the story of Rome, They know that like actually the one of the sort of elites in the Senate and the actual cosmopolitanism of the Senate actually came from Augustus Octavius, and the socialism side was more coming from Sanders and Antony. And I think a lot of this has to do with aesthetic framing. And and so if you're going to look into the umwelt of the situation, you could see that a lot of people, especially what you would call socialists, because I think socialist takes up a large canon. Like a lot of my friends who are conservatives, who are actually conservatives, they now consider themselves to be socialists. They're ranting against capitalism. They want their UBI, they want their Medicare for all, they want all of these things that that I think people on the left want as well, But I think it's a really interesting thing, because I'm starting to see that, like, if what you want to call as like the mass political body of socialism, if it does not meet the criteria of the mass aesthetic framework that it has to operate in, so if it's alienating itself from this framework of like I joked actually recently that like I was going to run as a politician, subverting the Republican Party with Austro-Marxist political theories, and I'm going to wear an American flag draped around my back when I come on stage, and I'm going to light my cowboy boots on fire. And and I think so much of this has to do with the preconditions of aesthetics, and I think it's really difficult because there's, for me, like I'm from LA, I'm a cosmopolitan guy, and a lot of these things, those aesthetic things, they don't really bother me for some reason. Like it almost seems like there's this allergy to I guess historical Americana amongst the left that kind of negates the ability to create an actual strange alliances and forge these kind of universal alliances that are necessary to actually get these things done. It's like, well, what is it that you want to get done? And what are the sacrifices you're willing to take to get these things done? Because you're always going to have to make sacrifices. I think Cardi B last night said something to Bernie Sanders. She said, well, open borders is capitalist, like, and that actually runs counter to the narrative of the official, of obviously not all members of the DSA, but this idea of open borders that they've actually sort of like endorsed, congregate wide. And so I think it,
for me.
Oh, what were you saying? Sorry.
I'm saying for me, I mean, I can talk about sort of like the warning signs earlier, but that's just too much like, oh, I'm so smart. But like for me, when the whole thing started to unfold, I just didn't understand it. Like, how could someone who was so uncompromising throughout the campaign, right? Was so uncompromising, both in aesthetics, in kind of like speech, but also in like the way he dealt with the rest of the candidates and the way he dealt with DNC and the rest, could become so like give it up all in 1 second.
Are you talking about 2016 election or 2020 election?
So if
because I thought he made complete concessions. He refused to attack Joe Biden.
No, that's what I mean. No, but okay, yeah. So he refused. Sanders refused to attack Joe Biden, but the rhetoric was, we need a political revolution, right? We need a political revolution, scaring the fuck out of all the centrists and all the rich people. But then when it came down to it, what happened to the political the situation?
But I don't think he scared the centrists.
I think he did. I mean, if he didn't scare the centrists, then he could have like negotiated with Warren, with others behind the scenes, saying like, we can't really let Biden win. What can we do? What kind of concessions can be made so we avoid Biden, right? But it seemed like he was so uncompromising and so sure that he's going to nail the nomination. And then all of a sudden, with like the loss in a Super Tuesday and then COVID coming in, everything was off, and he was willing to kind of like just forget about like the revolution, right? Like what happened to the revolution?
Well, I think revolution is defined in the Sanders campaign as something that I would almost define as sort of like non-revolution, because if you're going to have political advisors from Brooklyn and you're not going to be campaigning hard in places like South Carolina, which is primarily African-American place, then whose revolution are you absolutely serving? Are you serving, you know, like this sort of like New York hipster revolution, this idea of revolution for the sake of revolution, or are you talking about material? Because the thing that I find to be the worst part about this is not just the lack of actual strategy, but the lack of actual sort of like zealousness and faith. Like I actually saw him be very weak for the primaries. I actually saw him to be making decisions that he did not normally make. And this is, and I'm talking about like I'm talking about things basically as basic telltale signs, like his position on gun control in 2016 versus gun control now is completely anti-revolutionary. It's a centrist dream, you know. It sparks absolutely no fear in the heart of these people, sort of like nannying police, sort of like take away all of your.
Let's give your internet some rest and then bring in Aiken, because I think Aiken disagree with us.
Okay.
I don't disagree. I mean, I'm not gonna. So I think that I'd rather have Bernie in Senate than not have Bernie at all. And I think that there were all these criticisms after Hillary Clinton, when he supposedly didn't endorse Hillary Clinton quickly enough, which of course he did, but that the centrist media news networks all claim that he didn't support her quickly enough. And I think that there was a lot of pressure on him to endorse Biden very quickly. And him doing so essentially proved a lot of these centrist critiques wrong, because look who hasn't endorsed him yet. Warren. She may do so.
Warren just endorsed him.
She did today?
Yes, today,
Yeah.
like just when we were going into broadcast, Warren's endorsement arrived.
Yeah, well, I heard that it was going to happen this week. But, I mean, what I've been saying for the past few weeks and trying to get more active with is like voting down ballot. I don't think that we're going to be able to create a wholly autonomous Labor Party just because of the way that the United States political system is carved, which is a two-party system, not a majoritarian.
But don't we want to like destroy that political system? I mean, this is what I don't understand in your argument, and you got to let me speak, because we can't talk about changing the system, but then when it comes time to say, well, the political system allows us this or that, it's like there's a fundamental contradiction in that, because if you really want to change the system, you got to take some risks. And you can't just say, oh my God, well then, oh my God, Supreme Court and the system is two-party. And okay, if you want to take over Democratic Party, there's a way to go to do it. This is the second presidential election with that goal that completely ended up in failure.
I agree.
The whole issue is,
okay, one at a time.
But can I just say, when I say political system, I mean the infrastructure, like the way the Constitution of the United States is written. Unless one is a Democrat or Republican, they can't get seats in Congress, and they can't get seats within any of the local elections and such. So it has to be done as a fusion ballot, where it's working as a Labor Party and such, but also you can run as an auxiliary of the Democratic Party. Otherwise, we can create this third party, but unless we rewrite the Constitution to be a proportional representational system or a majoritarian system, which I would love to do, but I don't know how we would try to do it. All the attempts that have been done historically have been squelched very quickly. It's just like, it's like hyper camouflage a bit. The one has to work within the system to break it apart. But I mean, I think this is, it's a good conversation to have.
Barrett, your internet is not very good, Barrett. If you want to turn your video off, then we can actually hear your voice.
Really? Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I think is interesting is, do any of you people know people within the State Department, within government? Because I know a few, and I actually know some people who have socialist, Marxist, Leninist leanings who have found their way within the Trump world. You know, like, this is not a conspiracy theory. I'm not peddling you a conspiracy theory. I'm not peddling you a lie, but you have to understand that there's an entire party. I think there was a GOP senator who actually endorsed the concept of a Dutch economic proposal, which would pay 80% of workers' wages during this pandemic. Like, there is a movement of populism and left populism that's coming from this, what you want to say historically other side, but it was just the doors were open for this to happen. That, you know, the situation arose where a constituency of people who were, you know, culturally disaffected, but also wanted these sort of material things to manifest as well. This is why if you talk to most of these people who are Trump supporters, if you ask them, what do you think of Bernie Sanders? A lot of them say, well, I would like all the things Bernie Sanders wants, but, you know, he's a weak guy. He can't win, whatever, you know, he's just weak. And I agree. I think he's completely weak. I think it's almost pathetic, the sort of lack of zeal and faith that he has in his own sort of hypothetical ability toward, because at the end of the day, if you're peddling just pure reification, then all of this stuff about socialism and this and that, it just becomes commodity. It becomes commodity because it cannot find any true representational power. And I think that's the biggest issue that people are dealing with now is like, and so what do you say? Where do you go to where there is actual space, where there is unclaimed territory? Because there's this whole other side of people who socially disagree, and they're literally saying, no, you socialist Bernie people, like, I want you here. I want you to come to us. Like, I want to hear what you have to say, as where Joe Biden does not care what you have to say. If you listen to the anti-socialist rhetoric in mainstream media, it is almost unequivocally coming from liberal centrist Democrats. On CNN, on MSNBC, from people like political hitmen, like James Carville, to, you know, it's actually sort of astounding at the rhetoric that's like, it just becomes so self-evident in a certain point that, like, these are the people who actually really, really, really fucking hate you. Like, you know, so that's kind of my take on it. So
Yeah,
who hates you more?
Well, let's just like count them. Like now I'm gonna get to like all the warning signs, right?
Yeah.
He should have gone after Warren right away and with the most fierce force.
Yeah, I agree.
That's the first thing. He should have gone after Obama second, fearfully, and monsterized him.
Yeah.
Aggressively. And the work
Completely.
should have been done to basically recruit the radical Black community to go and speak to South Carolina and explain to people who are still thinking in that mindset that turned Kanye West into alt-right. They should have gone and spoken to those people to explain, you know what I mean, this enslavement to centrist Democratic Party and the perils of it for the larger African-American community. He failed to do that. Then, of course, there were also lots of positive stuff that was happening, but I'm not going to talk about positives right now. So I'm not saying there were anything positive, but also, basically when it came down to basically this last few weeks, right? The reason why independents and Republicans and radicals adored Sanders after 2016 was that he didn't give up so early. He stayed in the race. He tried his best.
Yes.
And he actually fought more rigorously in 2016.
Oh, completely.
Whereas 2020, he already was sort of like, he pledged something that like, I'll support any. Why are you doing that?
Yeah.
Then it came down to sort of like condemning Bernie bros was a big warning sign for me, because I thought, why are you going after I'm a fucking Bernie bro, okay? So it's like, I felt like insulted.
Yeah.
Like, we're doing class struggle within the confinements of liberal electoral politics in America. And if you can't explain that in simple language to people, and if you have to go on and apologize for people who are your foot soldiers, you're a loser. You're gonna lose, you know?
Well, I think a big part of it was
Let
the
me
sort of
finish. And the last one, I remember the day I woke up and they said de Blasio has endorsed Sanders, I was like, oh my God, that loser. Oh my God, it's over. If Blasio gets in, this is over. I was just so, of course, as someone who basically organized artists for Bernie, we brought 7,000 signatures of artists from around the world. I zipped my mouth and I was a loyal campaigner. But now it's over, so I can speak up, right? But it doesn't mean that like I dislike everything in the campaign, or there weren't magical moments, or there weren't any hope or anything, right? But I think the catastrophe to me was in the way he conceded. It was completely like uninspiring. And this is going to have a major effect on the next Democratic Socialist candidate 4 years from now or 8 years from now. Because again, what made it really good was the fact that he fought hard in 2016. That actually was the ignition of the 2020. You know, the meme, Bernie would have won. That really sustained us from the last, there's nothing to sustain. Except today was, and I'm going to end on this and pass it on to you or others who want to speak about this. You know, like AOC is really taking the rape charge seriously. So she just like, there was a news story where like AOC said the rape charges against Biden is total fair game. We should talk about that, right? Whereas I didn't hear Sanders speak a word about that. So I just feel like AOC and her ambitions, she's kind of like trying to distinguish herself. Maybe she's even like in bed with centrists, I don't know. But rhetorically, she's saying like, I'm the one who's going to continue on really being like a critical of Biden right now because Daddy Bernie just gave up. So that was like a glimmer of hope for me where I saw AOC wants to talk about the rape charges. You know, 3 weeks after New York Times and Washington Post did not report on it, basically censored it to let all the Super Tuesdays and everything go through before they actually kind of like dismissed the woman and said, no, we can't trust her, blah, 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 which is completely against the spirit of Me Too. Anyways, so I don't know. Aiken, do you want to speak or should we?
Yeah, I have a question for both of you because this is so Steve Bannon 2 weeks ago went on a very popular Marxist podcast called Red Scare, and it essentially made all these points that we've been making. One of the big points that he made, though, is that there's a place where potentially the radical left and the radical right, I mean, you know, it's been called shoehorn theory and such, but he's been speaking about it more in like an opportunistic sense where, and surprisingly, the two podcast hosts were able to almost prod him into agreeing that we have no option other than a single payer Medicare for all system to get, you know, out of this COVID mess. But is there any opportunity, because, you know, you're talking about AOC sort of making these criticisms of Biden. At the same time, there are some people in you know, who would be traditionally ascribed not within the conservative politics, but now operate within it, which will be going after him from the left. Like they'll be saying, you know, you tried to cut Social Security, you tried to cut Medicare, you sided with, you wrote the credit card bill. So, you know, is there an opportunity for radical leftists, and there's many of them that are running for Congress, so I would keep, you know, Adolph Reed Jr. is a great Black scholar who also talks about, you know, down ballot voting, and he's been doing a lot of interesting work. But in addition to supporting like these down ballot Democratic socialists, is there any opportunity, or is it completely mismanagement to see some type of bricolage with not Steve Bannon, obviously, but some of these, you know, people on the right, some of these Trump voters who obviously, you know, have something in common, the working class and so on?
Maybe Barrett would be better for that.
Well, I think a lot of it, again, I think it has to do with ceding aesthetic territory. It's like a lot of it has to do with meeting the body of energy, of political energy, in a place where they can actually visually and representationally understand your position as representational with theirs. And I think that, you know, like I have long hair. Again, cosmopolitan guy, not very, so I'm not going to say this from a position of myself because I should be taking my own advice, right? If I wanted political power, which I don't actually want. So that's why I keep looking the way that I do. But I know people who come from very subversive underground who have actually made their way in this world with ideas not very dissimilar from your guys's or mine or whoever's. And a lot of it just has to do with this, and it sounds very shallow, it sounds very superficial, and in a lot of ways it is, but we're all sort of playing in these games, in these symbolic visual aesthetic games. And I think to sort of not give any credence to that, I think is a really, really big mistake. Like, I think to say things like, because you said like one of these things about AOC is that she's actually going after Biden, which I think it's good that she's doing that because she's holding him accountable for the positions of Biden. Like when Biden talks about social justice issues, for example, when he talks about LGBT, I'm like, this guy is a 78-year-old senile guy. Who told him to say this? You know, like it just, none of it just historically adds up. Like there's a discontinuous, there's so many things that don't add up when you hear it.
Yeah, wait for the actual campaign to begin. All of these things, you're going to have answer to it from the position of Republicans and how they're going to go after Trump, right? After Biden. Look, I'm already mixing them up. But what we really need to realize, like, and deal with, and I think this is the dilemma of Sanders, is that because I also thought about this, that like if Sanders hasn't become weak in the last 4 years, and if he was always weak, right?
Yeah.
The reason why he stayed too long was that deep down he thought Hillary's going to win anyways, but he's not so convinced about Biden. So that's why he was willing to go further into the campaign with Hillary, thinking, oh, she's gonna win anyways. No one's gonna elect Trump. But now he's kind of like internal kind of like a guilt machine is making him think that, oh my God, this is serious. I gotta concede faster because there's no guarantee that Biden's gonna win. I can't play a revolutionary long enough because this is gonna have consequences, right? But that brings me to the point I was gonna raise, which is like, this is something that the leftists and the progressives and the socialists and the Marxists have to reckon with, right? That like, can a 4-year more of Trump be actually better for the long-term cause of taking over the Democratic Party or building a new party, whichever? I'm agnostic, right? Or electing Biden is. And I personally finally made up my mind this morning that I think, and you know what? I'm gonna get friends who will unfollow me on Facebook or here or there. I don't care. I'm an artist.
Yeah.
I think for the future, for a better future, I think I settle with 4 more years of Trump. I'm not going to campaign for Trump. I'm not going to vote for Trump. I can't even vote. I'm Canadian. But I really think we should try to maintain the majority of Democrats in the House, to not have a full dictatorship in a second term, which usually give them more power, because in a second term is when the president actually does his agenda, because they're not worried about getting elected again. So maintaining the majority in the House, even though half of them or more are centrist and the corrupt, doesn't matter, Democrats. So focus on down ballot, as Eric was saying, as Aiken was saying, try to get Democrats to maintain the majority in the House and also try to take over Senate. So I think DSA and those people, rather than trying to like suck Biden's dick, should really focus on congressional seats and Senate seats and help that way without really being forced to go out to basically back Biden or something, and try to understand that like having a strong Democratic Congress and Trump is actually better for the future that we envision for Democratic Party or a Labor Party or Socialist Party or whatever.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that, but I think it goes back to this And one of the things that you were talking about was the sort of fearlessness that Sanders had in 2016, thinking like, oh, Hillary's going to win anyway, I can sort of do this. I think it kind of actually goes back to the whole initial conversation about, you know, the consequences of heresy, you know, and thinking about, you know, like when I think about the Cathars or something like that, and not to get too abstract, but, you know, I think about, you know, this concept of the world being like the fundamental creation, the demiurge, the material being fundamentally wrong. And, you know, within us is this divine inner spark. And I think I relate a lot of the issue with what we see as heretical historically with kind of the average position of your basic liberal centrist, which is that they don't, is without the concept of the world being this materially inherent evil thing, but with this sort of imbued divine spark of the inside. And that's kind of like why I consider the centrist Democrats and liberals to be this sort of low form milquetoast variation of Gnostic, of Gnostic mysticism. But it's a very degraded, debased version of that. And so like, and what I found with Sanders in 2016 is he had that sort of zeal and that spirit that I think it actually takes. There has to be a freedom from fear. And I did not see that. I didn't see that at all. You know, and one of the things I thought was really great is when Bannon went on Red Scare, I was like, and you know, I like Red Scare. I think it's a good podcast. I like Anna Khachiyan's takes a little more than Dasha's, but and I've got my criticisms of them too in the way they counter virtue signal, because sometimes they say things just to say them to make people mad, and
antagonize. And
yeah, but I think that dialectical synthesis, even though it has its flaws, is very, very important. I think that is, so when if you want to talk about horseshoe theory, you want to talk about all these things, but I actually see a new crop of people from the right, if you want to call them the right, who are playing within that sort of visual field, who are actually trying to rise up the ranks through down ballots too, who want to enact some form of socialist policy. Now, again, with all of these people, these down ballot, these new emerging socialist factions, whether you come from the right or you come from the left, there's always going to be somebody who's going to miss out. You know, there's always going to be some marginalized person, you know, and I think that that you have to sort of negate, you have to mitigate that territory too. Like, how do you make the very sort of claim about, you know, when we talk about hospitality, what does it mean to have hospitality in this day and age in terms of like borders and all of these, you know, in refugees and in immigrants? It's like, how do you make sure that you're actually acknowledging the sort of material reality of natural history, because and also of geopolitical strategy that actually doesn't have very much to do with the moving of bodies of labor or of bodies or of cultural bodies, but how do you actually take that how do you take all of that into consideration while implementing these things, but also not doing it in the ways to demonize or critique these immigrants, for example? You know, like, how do you just acknowledge that? Like, it's, for example, like, I think it's interesting when you look at World War II, how America had this whole narrative that the reason we went to World War II was because Adolf Hitler and the Nazis were trying to take over the whole world. Now, when you create a false narrative that they were, because they were just trying to take over Eastern Europe, then you actually give rise to people who peddle these crazy conspiracy theories that the Holocaust never existed. Now, you create the sort of American exceptionalist concept that Adolf Hitler wants to come and he wants to take over America. He never wanted to do that, okay? So when you're peddling this sort of like false reality on this hand, then you're basically giving all this credence to all these people who are then saying the Holocaust exists. Well, what if both of them are wrong? What if the Holocaust was real, but he didn't want to take over America? You know, and so I think that there's a big dissonance here where people's sort of like bad forms of Straussian noble lies and these kind of things that are not very artfully constructed and are not very noble. Like when Pelosi and you know, Schumer peddle in these sort of like Straussian like sort of forms of myth making. They're doing it on such a low, degraded
at every
form.
turn. None of these things worked.
No, none. But they're not going to work for the Democrats either. This is the issue. Like, it's not working for the Democratic centrists either. So it's like, it's not working for the people who are supposedly on the left, who may form some new alliance with the Bannon kind of more non, you know, but it's not working for this Democrats. Like, that's the whole issue too.
One of the other warning sign was when Sanders endorsed the impeachment. He should have opposed the impeachment, saying, like, I'll meet Trump at the election. Yeah, he's a horrible president, but this is just like a waste of time. And I'm not even going to vote in it. And I'm not even going to attend these sessions. I'm going to go campaign. And I think
it's just kabuki theater. And this is the whole issue, is that when Sanders comes out, you know, after he basically concedes the election to Biden, you know, before he officially dropped out, he's sort of sitting there saying, oh, we need $2,000 a month. This is all nice, but a lot of it is a grandstanding gesture to look good after the fact that you had given up. So you had already voted, but the thing is, he had already voted. He had already endorsed, along with AOC, along with all these radical people, the Democratic stimulus plan, which was also very, very flawed in many, many ways, which was an ultimate concession. You should have just said, no, fuck you, I'm not voting for this shit either.
And the vote didn't need that one vote. It would have passed.
It didn't need the vote, yeah.
He could have just symbolically refrained from voting, right? But anyways, it's 9:30, and I think let's just see if anybody else wants to join. Anybody else has something to say that wants to, like, addressing any of the topics that were discussed, because there's still like around 20 people in the Zoom. But if not, maybe we can say goodbye. And I just have a few notes I would like to say about the program. First of all, we're extracting the sound and enhancing it and making them available as kind of like podcasts on SoundCloud. So you can listen to all the past episodes on SoundCloud now. We're going to make that sort of like a social media post about it. But if you search for SoundCloud News Center, you will see all the past episodes, and hopefully this one by tomorrow there to kind of like play in the background. Another thing is that our next week episode is going to be related to the impact of the pandemic on the art world, both like the specific world of contemporary art that is very small and narrow, but also more general world of creativity and creation. And I'm hoping that Jason would still come to it, because he had amazing ideas last week about the place of creativity. And I mean, he's practicing it now for 2 weeks in a row in our program. But it would be amazing if he can also come. And and next week's program is co-curated or co-put together between me, Valentin. Reza's going to be absent next week. It's going to be between me, Valentin, and my dear friend and colleague, Adnan Misail, Turkish curator. He was actually in the first session, and he had a dialogue with Alan. So we basically, I've invited a group of curators and artists and art professionals to join next week to discuss the fate of the art world in light of these massive changes that are happening. So anyways, anybody wants to speak, or should we say goodbye? I don't see anyone in the chat room or nothing. Okay.
No, maybe I can I?
Oh yeah, go ahead, Davor. Excellent. We have you in the house. I forgot.
Yeah. Hi, just hello everybody. So I was listening and watching all the time, and you know.
Davor, please turn your camera on.
Should I? Wait a second. I need to do stuff. Does it work? Yeah, here I am.
Yes, there you
go. Hello. I just wanted to say quickly just one thing. So what would have happened if Sanders would have become president now in this situation?
Oh, the beginning of a fight, actually. It would have been just the beginning of another set of like struggles, and no guarantee of any kind of like anything. Sure,
Yeah, you see, that is my point. So I just wanted to say.
No, there is a point, because
Yeah.
Sanders is someone who is at least on our side, or he can be lobbied
Yeah.
much more effectively than Biden. That's the only difference I would put.
Okay. Oh. No, okay. I was just thinking so that maybe, you know, in the next 2, 3, 4 years, there will be really just cleaning up the mess of Corona, so to speak. So that you cannot be to do effectively politics in this time, especially not when we're experimental. You know, we are revolutionary, so to speak. I mean, for America. So maybe he just gave up because he saw it doesn't make sense. Let's postpone it in 4 years. You know, the situation will be different, and then maybe there's a better chance to do something.
Yeah, we are talking about the way he left and the timing, not the fact that he would leave, because probably all of us had this kind of like deep understanding that he will not going to be able to grab the nomination, right? So we're really arguing here about the style that the campaign was done and the way he conceded. Really, that most of the argument is about that, and the impact it has on the future of the democratic socialist movement or any kind of like emancipatory politics in American electoral system. Really, that's what the fight is about, to me.
Yeah, I just heard some disappointment, and I don't think we should be disappointed about it. You know, on the opposite, I think it's maybe a good solution for what happened, actually.
Well, we'll see, right? Valentin, do you have any final remarks? No? Okay, well, thank you everyone for being with us for another 2.5 hours. We will be with you next week with an edition specific to the arts. So thanks again and see you next week. Bye-bye. Oh yeah, Kasra, thank you so much for moderating. Maybe turn your camera on because we didn't do that last week. People need to see you. He's the fellow who's like really pulling the strings behind the scene here, sitting right next to me in this purple red room. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, see you everyone. Bye-bye.